to what you talked about today, and I was reading your legislation. There's a blighted community, a blighted neighborhood in a community. Let's say Lexington, my community, and the city decides that this is unsanitary, it's unhealthy, and it breeds crime. And we believe we've got a better use for that. We want to build a hospital in that community that the public can have access to. Okay. So the city decides that it's going to engage in eminent domain, take those dilapidated, as you indicated, these dilapidated, deteriorated homes, and then turn that property and make it available to whatever health organization or hospital or clinic wants to buy that, provide access to medical care for those individuals. I don't see why the city should be stopped from doing that. And to hear you suggest that the city should pay whatever the value of a hospital is, that somehow whatever you want to turn that property into, that becomes the standard for determining value, that's so speculative to me and seems very contrary to, again, 200 years of law that says you look at what that property is worth now and you pay justly for what that property is worth now. So why shouldn't the city be able to take that land, pay whatever that blighted, deteriorated land is worth now, and then turn that property or use that property for a health clinic or hospital that's going to provide benefit to the entire public? Answer that question for me.
I think that may be more him. I was more agriculture based, but I didn't say anything about houses.
So, one, House Bill 353 does not prohibit eminent domain. It first requires, in the instance that you're talking about, homes are in a state of blight. It just requires that the property owners be given the opportunity to cure. I don't think anyone should be against that, especially given that that is their property. If they are given 2 notices and opportunities to cure, they decide not to, at that point, eminent domain is acceptable. As to the compensation issue, the reality is this. The market exists on a fundamental notion of consent. It exists upon the idea that you own what is yours, and if we're talking about building a hospital, if a medical developer comes to me seeking to purchase my house, my calculation is going to be different than if I'm just looking at someone who just wants to purchase the property to be a dwelling, because they have different incentives. That's just how the market works. Now, as to the question of public benefit versus public use, the Fifth Amendment takings clause has not been used for over 200 years just for a public benefit. The exact text of the Fifth Amendment is, nor shall private property be taken for public use, not benefit, use, without just compensation. For me, what is just compensation? My view of justice is that it's all rooted in consent. The notion that it's been transferred over to private entities, the Supreme Court had never interpreted the Fifth Amendment to allow that until June 23rd of 2005, exactly 20 years and 1 month ago in the Kelo case, which, thinking of the consequences of it, I think we have to consider that this wasn't a home in blight. This was a well-maintained home that, by the way, the corporation once taking possession of never developed what they said they were going to develop. These projects are often completely disregarded, but as Sandra Day O'Connor said in her dissent, the specter of condemnation hangs over all property. Nothing is to prevent the state from replacing any Motel 6 with a Ritz-Carlton, any home with a shopping center, or any farm with a factory. Mr. Chairman and members of this committee, this goes well beyond the blight issue and goes to every single property owner in the Commonwealth, and we do not provide adequate protections to those individuals. And I believe that this bill absolutely gives an opportunity to address blight while also protecting those who have been good stewards of their property.
Senator Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very interesting discussion. I've kind of goes back. I'm actually involved in a condemnation case for an easement right now, and experiencing some of the same issues that you mentioned. And I really think what this discussion goes to in general is a discussion of really the concept of what is the appropriate level of damages for either a taking, or in some cases I've about quit taking property cases because no one ever ends up satisfied, because the measure of damages in that case, for those that don't know, is the cost of repair or the diminution in value. So, if you damage somebody's property and it cost them $200,000 to repair it, but only diminishes the value by, say, $50,000, you get the lesser of the two, which I do believe to some degree that goes back to English common law, but I don't know that we broke away from England because they weren't always right. So I think that really what you're getting at here really deserves, I think, a broader discussion, because I think a lot of times, and unfortunately usually it happens due to some type of larger person with deeper pockets and greater political and economic influence being able to damage a person in some way or other, whether it be from taking their property via the state or a large corporation using their rights either statutorily under eminent domain to intrude on private property. And I think it also begs the question that if you are, for example, as you said, taking a piece of private property for, say, like a P3, a public-private investment, should not the property owner get a little bit of the upside too, rather than merely, having to take what the fair market value is at that time? And so, I like the concept. I'd actually maybe like to see it broadened out a little bit more, but be interested in some further discussions, specifically on the issue of property damages. What is the appropriate measure when someone suffers an injury to their property? I think that I can think of particularly like in a blasting case that I've been involved in. They live in a house that's cost them $400,000 or $500,000 to build, maybe on some property that their dad lived on, or an older house, but maybe it's not in a place that most people want to live. So maybe the house is only worth on a market $150,000. Should they have to spend that money to repair something? Should they get the lesser, not enough money to repair something that's theirs, just because they chose to live in a certain place? It's just really not a fair measure of damages. So I do appreciate this concept, this discussion, Representative Roberts, and I look forward to having further discussions with you on it.
Senator Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I 100% agree, Representative Roberts and Bevins. Thanks for coming in. Man, what a awesome American patriotic topic to be discussing today. I grew up on the land as well. I got blood, sweat, and tears in my property. And, those of us who grew up on the land know that you ain't no kind of man unless you have land, so you're going to fight hard for it. When I ride on my property, I can actually look over the hill and see Representative Decker's property. And I promise you that if the government or anyone tried to come and take our property, they'd be in for a fight. The Constitution, as a reminder, was designed to protect the people, we the people, from the government, not allow the government to have power over us. So, I believe wholeheartedly it's our duty to protect that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members, for coming and talking about this today. I don't think you'll find at least in either in the House and Senate caucus, anybody that would be opposed to private property rights. And I think that this General Assembly has done a lot of things to invest in economic development, and we've seen some successes from that. Which has been really good for the economy, for the state of Kentucky, and because of that, we've had to do some critical infrastructure, new power lines, new water, new sewer, and we've paid a lot of money to put new sewer and water facilities in local areas. So I think, and by the way, I'm appalled that the government can just decide that we think that this might be a good spot for an economic development site, so we'll take it from you. I work in economic development, and there's sites that I see that are farmland, and I go to the farmer and I'd say, what would you sell this for? And, we've seen this $50,000, $65,000 an acre, and guess what? If we want it, that's what we pay for it. Condemning it and then getting it at a low cost is pretty appalling to me. But my concern is, and maybe you can talk to it a little bit about, is this rising energy needs that we're going to have all across America. Some project 25, 80% increase in the amount of energy that we're going to need. How does this process not slow? I'm not talking about taking whole swaths of property. I'm talking about easements. I'm talking about how do we avoid, getting critical power to those locations that we need it.
Well, I think part of what's missing in society today is conversation. I think first and foremost, the conversation has to happen. I'll give you a prime example. Living in rural Kentucky, we farm over a 40-mile stretch. I deal with a lot of different farms. I've got multiple utility companies that come across. I had a contractor call the other day, and we had us a conversation because they're getting ready to replace poles. And I said, well, why can't you do this when the crop's not in the ground? And he says, well, we're on a time crunch. I said, okay. And he tells me the company he's with, and I said, well, that's good. I said, I don't have much love lost for him. And I shared with him, and it goes back to this concept, you treat people the way you want to be treated. I don't care if you're Republican, you're Democrat, man, woman, what it is. You treat people the way you want to be treated. And I shared with him the story a few years ago when this same company, contractor was coming across some other property we had. I pulled in one day. I tried to accommodate them. It was a rented piece of land. I asked them that night, if they didn't care, if they could move their equipment that they were just randomly parking out in the field. And, and for those of you not involved in agriculture, we look at things not only when you look at a field, there's other things that matter. Compaction is a huge issue. You don't think about that. When it comes to growing a crop, how that affects the yield that we get off that crop. And, I wasn't fussing at them about parking out in the field. They were making themselves at home, but I just asked them that night to please move their stuff over to the side. There was a grass lot there they could park in so I could spray that field. They knew it was getting time for me to plant. I came back, messed up my time schedule. Instead of being there in the day, I went back at 10:30 that night to spray that field, and I swear they doubled the amount of equipment they had in the field. And they placed it further out. Well, as a business owner myself, that I'm trying to work with somebody, that aggravates me. And when stuff is one-sided, so that's our number one problem. We got to start communicating. Now, let me tell you, this guy immediately changed his tune. He's like, we hear this all the time. He said the shame of it is, he said, these dummies didn't realize that they're not only pissing a farmer off, they're pissing off a future legislator. And we've got to start thinking about it. I don't care what clothes you are, if you're dirty, if you're in a suit and tie, if you're in overalls. You treat people right and you have those conversations. All of us understand the needs. Like I said before, number one thing, you're not going to find anybody that respects private property rights any more than I do. Because I don't want somebody telling me what to do with my ground. I can't tell somebody else what to do with theirs. But also, there's not a single one of us that don't appreciate utilities. But I think we have to be smart about it. Because oftentimes you look at, we'll put a road in, we'll put a power line in to try to get something to a destination, and we look at the cheapest avenue to get there, which most time to get from point A to point B is the shortest run. We don't think about how that impacts, what impacts we leave behind, what those unintended consequences were. I share with you, we talked about this time, there was a road that was put in our community probably 30 years ago. There's bridges across two creeks. We happen to farm on the upper side on one of those. Now, the guy that farms on the lower side of that bridge, he had no problem getting a crop in this time. Because the way the bridge was built, it funnels water. And it allows it to roll out of the creek, and his field dried off. I dealt with backwater standing on these fields forever because when an engineer, which I'm just a dumb farmer, I'm not an engineer, I don't have that degree. When they designed this, they never thought about that. And maybe they did intentionally. Or oftentimes the fact when roads are put in and we put a culvert in, so those are conversations I like to have. I don't want to see us hold back anything. If a community wants to develop economic, have economic development, yeah, we need to get the resources to them, but also we need to start respecting those landowners. It's all about respecting the communication. You go back and you talk to those individuals. I've never met anybody that doesn't want to work with somebody, but I can tell you right now, I've met a whole lot of farmers, and I have dealt with it personally, that have a negative story where they have been impacted by a utility contractor. So sometimes we build the roads ourselves or make the beds that we have to lay in. So yes, it's a problem. But I think in those instances, we need to be careful about using it eminent domain. You talk about pipelines sometimes. You talk about power lines. It's not just about what's on top of the ground. It's about the massive amount of money that has been invested under the ground. Drainage tile is something nobody ever thinks about, and that's a huge investment. You could be looking upwards of $1,500 an acre, and you start talking about thousands of acres. We've invested a lot of money putting those systems in. And one hole drilled in the wrong spot ruins that whole system. So anyway, hope that answered your question, Representative.
And if I may as well, I just want to say one thing about this is, I know there's the characterization of the dumb farmer. I think that Representative Bivens is a smart farmer, and I think that's the case for a lot of farmers as well. I can think of one time where there was a need for a road in Iowa. This was before government got to the point of sophistication we see it at now. It was the farmers that built that road. They coordinated it, and in a shorter time than it takes to fill a pothole in sometimes, they got a road from one end of Iowa to the other. But specifically to your concern about utilities, I want to talk about how House Bill 353, if anything, would actually speed up the development projects that we see. Part of that burden analysis that I mentioned, where the government must provide proof that this is necessary, the exact language is, in determining whether the petitioner, the government, has the right to condemn the property or the use and occupation of the property sought to be condemned, the petitioner bears the burden of proving by a preponderance of the evidence that the property the petitioner seeks to acquire is required for public use. So this doesn't necessarily get rid of the eminent domain project in itself. It just simply says, do we need to take the property in its entirety, or would a simple easement be sufficient where we can just use it and the farmers can still do their jobs? But second, and to your point particularly, the petitioner has a plan that reflects a reasonable schedule to complete the public use after the petitioner takes ownership of the property. One of the biggest problems we see is people lose their property to eminent domain, and then the project gets abandoned. This makes clear that if we're taking someone's property for a public use, by golly, we better be using it. We better not have empty lots like Suzette Kilo's old home. We better not have these empty lots that if we're using the property, it better give that public benefit, give that public use. 3, petitioner has access to funding to complete the public use. So these guys aren't going to take people's property and not have the funds. They need to have the funds ready to go so that way this project is completed as quickly as possible. And 4, public use cannot be accomplished by using or acquiring other property with the consent of the owner of the other property without an unreasonable delay or increase in cost. So this actually focuses on streamlining these processes as well, but also protecting the property owners.
Representative Kulkarni.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here today and presenting on this topic. Thank you, Ms. Steele and Mr. Van Meter. I remember our discussion earlier this year. Representative Bivens and Representative Roberts, thanks for bringing it. Rep. Roberts, I think this might be a rare occasion where I agree with you conceptually. But this is a very broad concept, and of course the devil is in the details, right? This is the idea of eminent domain is going to look very different on your land, any of your properties, than it might in Louisville or Lexington. And so I want to understand, I have a couple of questions just related to the bill itself. Is this a model bill? So is this something that has been implemented in other states? And the reason I ask that is because Kentucky is unique. Every state is unique. Is there some way to tailor it more to the needs that we have specifically? And then the other question is, what has been the opposition to this particular piece of legislation or model legislation like this in other states?
Thank you for the question, Representative. So this is a variation of model policy. So I did tailor it a little bit. I'm open to amendments to make sure that it's more of a Kentucky-centric model that adequately protects Kentucky property owners, of course. As to the question of implementation in other states, similar legislation, none of which is identical, but similar legislation. Currently, we rank 38th in protection of property owners. So 11 states are worse than us in this